A scream in the night woke George Flot. His wife, Margaret, awoke and approached the window of their home on the top of a hill of South Mountain near Sabillasville, Maryland. She exclaimed that there was smoke rising from John Newey's cabin in the nearby valley, just a quarter of a mile away. George arose quickly from his slumber and ran to rally his sons to aid their nearest neighbors. George had to wonder why the year 1831 had to begin with such hubbub. It was January the 1st, and as George gathered the help of his boys hours before dawn, his eldest son ran into the crisp New Year air to assess the situation. The son soon returned on top of John Newey's horse, which made for a quick return, and reported that the whole house was on fire and none of the Newey family were about the home. George and the remainder of his sons gathered together and rushed to the neighbor's home, which now was a growing inferno. George looked into the burning home and saw his neighbor, John Newey, laying on the floor on top of his gun with his head cracked open like an egg. John Newey's wife, Lydia, lay dead in the bed. Two little girls under the age of 5 lay smoldering in the flames while their grandfather lay burning and a servant boy's body was crumbled on the floor. George quickly rallied his sons to go get the other neighbors to help put out the fire and examine the scene. He took up a horn and blew hard into it to hopefully rally more locals in shorter time, but to no avail. Once the neighbors arrived, they feared the worst. The Neweys were dead. This is the story of the Newey murders. Good evening. I'm here in Sabillasville, Maryland with my cousin, Ben Berman here, whose paternal family is from this particular area. Actually, the story that we're going to be telling tonight involves Ben's 5th great grandfather, whose name was Jacob Tressler. Now, unfortunately, where this event occurred, as I try to do with my other videos, I try to find the location and go there. Unfortunately, I was unable to get permission to enter the private property that contains the foundation of the burnt down dwelling that's associated with these events. So we just decided to film here in a nearby public area. This is actually a trail access to the Appalachian Trail. We figured we film here and eventually may take you over to the road near the actual property. But first off, before we start tonight's main feature though, Ben here is going to tell us some ghost stories that may be relevant to tonight's story. So take her away.
Okay. So just to start out, just a ghost story that I've heard from some relatives over the years, and then just from hearing some, local folklore about the ghost surrounding this, is there was a gentleman that lived on a relative's property nearby. He stayed in the one barn whenever it was cold out. And he helped out on the farm and everything, during his time there in order to stay in the barn when it was cold. Now, what gets interesting is he claims that one night outside of the barn in the woods that a woman dressed in white was walking through the woods. Now, he chalked this up to maybe, someone was out and about wandering and just was out for the night hanging in the area. What gets even more interesting is that, he started to get a little more freaked out when he claims that the woman was dancing with a child in the barn floor, and they were dancing and laughing and playing, and he sort of thought, okay, this is getting a little strange. Why is this happening? What's going on here? There's a little bit more to this. And eventually he decided to leave the barn altogether. And the relative of ours claimed to have seen him outside of a convenience store the one day and in the blistering cold. And when asked why he left the barn, he claimed that the woman dressed in white was walking around with wounds in her abdomen, and her head was severed and held in her hands. And she was walking around the barn and in the surrounding woods nearby. And for this reason, he said, "I will never go back to that barn ever again." Hopefully that paints an interesting picture.
That's a very interesting picture. So Ben actually gave me the idea of doing this video because of the interesting story behind the Newey murders. Now, he actually, before I ever told him the research, so I did the research on it, went online, was finding out this story and finding information on it. Before I ever told him the research, he told me these ghost stories. And I was kind of just sitting there like smiling, going, yeah, it makes sense. And he kind of looked at me like, what? And then I told him the story, which I'm going to tell you here shortly. And that story that I told corresponded so well. I remember his eyes just got like huge. He's like, oh my God, you know, like, so it's just an interesting, it's interesting how the ghost story, either if being true, legend, folklore, whatever, falls in line well with the story that I'm about to tell you. Greetings from the Devil's Race Course. So apparently in Sabillasville, or at least nearby, there's this place called the Devil's Race Course, which is where we decided to come. But anyway, it's a giant strip of just nothing but a pile of rocks. So we came here to check this out and to be close to the area and where this story occurred. So let's begin that story. This was to be a happy day for an engaged couple, John Newey and Lydia Tressler. They were to be married in front of their family and friends and start a life together by raising a beautiful family. During the wedding preparations, a large, burly young man named John Markley, who was a nephew of John Newey, coveted some items. Markley and his cousins stole a wedding suit, a watch, and $250 from John Newey. Now, John Markley and his cousin were caught, and they were charged by John Newey with burglary and theft. At the trial, which was held on October the 26th, 1825, John Newey testified against John Markley and his cousin, which resulted in both receiving jail time at the penitentiary. Now, Markley received the longest sentence, which was 5 years in prison. As Markley was escorted out of the courtroom and to jail, he exclaimed that he would have his revenge. At the jail, Markley continued by saying, "The state's attorney and the judges were no better than Newey and the witnesses, or they would not have believed them. And if I ever get out, I will have satisfaction if I have to kill and burn up the whole lot of them." Markley was told that after 5 years in prison that he would forget about it, and he yelled, "I will never forget." Markley was released from prison on November the 25th, 1830. Markley was seen in the area of Sabillasville, Maryland. On December the 21st, 1830, he asked for supper and lodging at John Black's house on the turnpike between Emmitsburg, Maryland and Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. He carried no bags at the time. This was 7 miles from Newey's house. He left after breakfast, and he left without paying. Now, John Newey at the time lived in Harbaugh Valley, about a quarter mile away from George Flot. And Harbaugh Valley, from our location here, is just that away, not all that far away, just a few miles. Now, Newey and his wife Lydia, at the time in 1830, had 2 little girls, Anne and Ruth. Both were under the age of 5 years old. Now, Lydia at the time was pregnant with their 3rd child. In the household was young John Coombs. John Coombs was an indentured servant who was serving as an apprentice to Newey. Now, visiting was Lydia's father, Jacob Tressler, who is the 5th great-grandfather of Ben here. and he was staying at the Newey home at the time. John Newey was warned that Markley was in the area, and remembering the threats that Markley made to kill him and burn down his home, Newey had his rifle ready. Now, Markley was spotted on December the 30th, 1830, within 2 miles of Newey's house, inquiring if Newey still lived in the same place that he did 5 years previously. Unable to sleep, Mrs. George Flot woke to look out the window towards the Newey home, which the Newey home would have sat somewhere in Harbaugh Valley, which is where we're standing at right now. Harbaugh Valley, we're actually along Skunk Hollow Road. I can't tell you exactly where on Skunk Hollow Road, but we're on Skunk Hollow Road. And in this area in Harbaugh Valley would have been the house where the Neweys were. But anyway, Mrs. George Flot woke to look out the window towards the Newey home. She alarmed her husband, who ordered their eldest son to investigate while he rallied the rest of his sons. The eldest son returned to say that the house was on fire. Now, George Flot arrived to find John Newey with his head cracked open by an axe. His head was on fire and lying face down on the floor on top of his own rifle. Newey's head was towards the door, and his feet were towards the bed on the ground floor of the house. Now, Lydia Newey was laid dead in the bed, while the linens and her head was on fire. The 2 girls were found dead, roasted by the fire. Mr. Jacob Tressler, who is Ben's 5th grade grandfather, and Mrs. Newey's father, was found completely engulfed in flame, and not much was recovered of his body except for bits of bone. The indentured servant boy, John Coombs, was half burnt up. Once the neighbors were rallied, they began to put water on the fire and remove what they could. The biggest task was to remove Mrs. Newey for examination. The bed and her body were preserved best by fallen debris, protecting it from fire from above. Now, her head was on fire and most likely was burnt off in the process, similar to what her husband's head was. Now, the bed and linens were covered in blood, and she was stabbed 3 times in the abdomen while in bed, for the linens had holes in them that matched with the wounds in her body. Now, the holes in the linen matched the holes in her body, which meant that, they were stabbing while she was laying in bed covered up. George Flot's eldest son testified later that the house appeared to have been set on fire in 2 places, both upstairs and downstairs, and roughly about the same time, suggesting that at least 2 men did this. The bodies of all 6 family members, father, mother, grandfather, the 2 little girls, and the servant, were removed to a place a few miles from the home and buried in shallow graves, for the ground was too frozen to dig. Now, the grave site of these murder victims is actually located just behind us, not that far away, actually more towards the trees over here, on your right. The reason why we're not there is because it's also on private property and we do not have permission to enter that area. But it was the Newey family graveyard, and they buried them in an unmarked grave, and it wasn't until recently until somebody actually paid to put a stone up for these poor murder victims. Now, I cannot disclose the location to you because I do not have permission to get there, but I am sure if you spend 5 or 10 minutes on the internet, I'm sure you would be able to find the location of the Newey family cemetery. So again, we're in Harbaugh Valley along Skunk Hollow Road, and we're in the vicinity of where these murders occurred. Now, if you recall from what I said earlier, or what Ben said earlier about his ghost stories and stuff, about the woman in white, and then the woman playing with the child, and then the woman that showed up with the abdomen wounds and her head in her hands. It's interesting because when he was telling me this story and I was listening to him, I had this grin on my face going, wait a minute, that corresponds so well with this. And then I told him my research and what I came up with, and he was amazed at what I came up with and how it matched, because this story begins with a wedding where Lydia Tressler Newey would have worn a wedding dress, a white dress. She had 2 children and one on the way. One of these children might have been what she was playing with in the barn when the man saw the lady. And then the third time he saw the lady, she had her severed head in her hands and stab wounds in her abdomen. Matches perfectly with Lydia Tressler Newey's death, because she had 3 stab wounds in her abdomen, and of course her hair was on fire when they found her, and most likely was burnt off of her body by the time they were able to recover it. So it's interesting to see how this ghost story / folklore matches with actual history of the story. Now Ben here, he wants to add a little extra to your ghost stories for this evening, and talk about his experiences in these woods.
So yeah, just, being up here, this used to be part of like the family farm and all that, and over the years we got to be on the land and be near the site of where everything occurred. And one of the biggest things I remember was I've hunted on both sides of the property. So the portion that I'm going to tell you about a little bit is I've been near the barn where the supposed ghost stories happened, and never had anything weird happen. Just hearing the story of the Neweys years later always kind of had that like eerie feeling being up there. Now the other side of the road, I've been to where the foundation is. Around the time that we were looking, the family farm was being, moved and all that and sold and everything. We went up to that side, checked it out, and it was very interesting. We got to go to where the unmarked graves were. We got to go to the foundation, and you could see the post for where the house once stood, and the brick was also there. You could see some bricks were in the ground. You could see where the house once was. And I've hunted on that side of the property too. Very eerie during an early morning time frame, because sometimes there's a lot of fog that comes up. Yeah, aside from like the hunting stories, eerie morning fog, seeing that foundation, we had gone up there before to have like, kind of like a ghost story session with the family, at one point before the property was sold and everything. So it's interesting though, I've driven back here at night before, just, going different places and stuff like that, or, kind of just taking friends back to, around this time of year to tell them, the ghost stories and stuff like that, the relatives have kind of mentioned over the years, and then just some other people that I know that know about it. When you drive back to the road at night, you'll notice anywhere else it seems like there's some illumination in the sky. You see like the stars and all that, but I remember driving back a couple times and it almost feels like you're driving into this tunnel. So it's just pitch black at night. Typically you're driving back the road and it just feels like you're going into this like tunnel, and then eventually you have to turn around and come back the road and everything. But yeah, very, very strange feeling, and you definitely feel it now, having learned the story from Dakota with his research and everything, and hearing just the little bit of ghost stories that I've heard during my childhood and young adult years and everything. Yeah, if you ever drive around this area at night, just be on the lookout for any ghosts.
Markley arrived at Bernard W. Wright's house in Smithburg, 7 miles from Newey's house. Another man was with him, later identified as Christian Freitinger. Now, according to Wright, Markley had a knapsack, roughly sewed, and it was full of clothes. Both Markley and Freitinger took supper, and both were very hungry. Now, Wright knew of the Newey murders at the time, and he expected that these men may have been the murderers, so he sat up all night as Markley and Freitinger slept, just to keep an eye on them. They arose before daybreak, and Markley pulled out his purse containing about $7 or $8 in silver. Wright recognized the purse as one he saw John Newey have at his house not but 2 weeks previously. Now remember, Earlier, when Markley stopped, he had to get something to eat at a tavern. He didn't left without paying. He had no money. And he also carried nothing with him. Now he's carrying clothes, and he has a coin purse with money in it, with $7 or $8 in silver. Now Markley and Frodinger said that they were going to take the New Cut Road towards Frederick. They actually traveled to Westminster, Maryland, and then proceeded to Baltimore. Markley arrived in Baltimore and stopped at Joshua Kelly's Tavern and paid in advance for a week's board, which amounted to $2.50. Again, with money that he didn't have not all that long ago. In the bar, he opened up his bundle of clothes he carried and selected a blue coat that he wanted cleaned. While there, he discussed with other patrons the story of the Newey murders, which of course has made major headlines. A Mr. W. Walker and 2 or 3 good citizens apprehended Markley in northwest Baltimore and took him for examination by Judge James Blair. He was found with a $10 Chambersburg, Pennsylvania note and a bag of new clothes. While being examined by the judge, Markley said that he was born near Hagerstown, Maryland, that he had never been arrested before, and he had been in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania the night of the murder that occurred at the Neweys. When asked why the clothes he carried were too small for his large frame, Markley could not give a satisfactory answer. With the unsatisfactory and contradictory answers to the judge's questions, Markley was committed for further examination at a later date. Markley was carried off to prison, where he was obviously recognized, proving that he was indeed arrested before. Now, Christian Frodinger was also apprehended and examined as a possible accomplice, but was found innocent and freed with lack of evidence. Markley's trial began in Frederick, Maryland on May 18, 1831, in front of Chief Justice Buchanan and a jury of his peers. The defense assigned to Markley provided no witnesses. The first witness called by the prosecution was George Flot, Newey's closest neighbor. Now, George Flot was used to the courtroom system. He was sued many times in his life, and he had sued just as many men as had sued him. He was very active in suing people. George Flot testified that his wife woke him about smoke coming from Newey's, his oldest son going to investigate, and his arrival to the burning home. He said, "I had a good view of all the inside of the house and saw Newey lying on the floor with his feet towards the bed and his head towards the door. The hair was burned off his head and the skull and skin appeared quite white. And on the right side of his head there was a hole. It appeared to have been done with an axe. The skull was broken in. There were small cracks from the main wound like the cracks of an eggshell. I examined it particularly, as I expected I would have to testify on the subject." He also said, by the time the neighbors came up, the head of Newey was entirely burnt to ashes. As to the others, George Flot testified, "I did see Mrs. Newey after the neighbors came up. She lay in the bed downstairs. Her head was burned off. She was otherwise much burned. Old Mr. Tressler was burnt up entirely. The infants were less burnt. The bound boy was nearly consumed." George Flot was asked if it was possible, if the floor was burning all around him, that there was no smoke near the body to obscure it, thinking that he might have not been able to see what he says he saw. And Flot's reply was, "The smoke was in the heavens. There was none about the body. When we burn trash, there is smoke enough in the clouds, but none about the flame." The second witness was John Flot, George's son, who was the first on the scene. he corroborated his father's testimony. The third and fourth witnesses corroborated the stories of Mrs. Newey being stabbed 3 times and were present when the body was removed from its grave for examination. There were also exhibits of tangible evidence as well. Among the clothes that Markley carried with him, a pair of pantaloons was presented as evidence. Mr. John King, who was the son of John Newey's sister, Sarah, identified the pantaloons as his uncle's, which of course was John Newey. The day of John and Lydia Newey's wedding, back 5 years previously in 1825, Mr. King borrowed these pantaloons to wear to the ceremony, and that his mother had to mend it with white thread. King identified the stitches on the pantaloons. Now, Sally Manahan stated that the handkerchief found in the bundle and bearing a yellow patch had belonged to the Neweys. She recognized it as something that she washed while working for the Neweys as a housekeeper. Mr. Nichols testified that 2 vests Markley possessed belonged to John Newey and Mrs. Newey's brother. A Mr. Oyster identified a razor and a shaving box and a razor strap that Markley possessed as being Newey's also. Mr. Bernard W. Wright testified that the purse used by Markley to pay him for staying in his house was one that John Newey carried. The jury retired for deliberation at this point, and after a half an hour, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. After a passionate scolding of Markley for his heinous acts, the judge finally sentenced him to be hanged by the neck until dead. Inside the Hessian Barracks in Frederick, Maryland, Markley waited to be led to the gallows. Reverend David Schaefer, appointed by the court to be Markley's confessor, asked for Markley to confess to his crimes. Markley admitted to the commission of every conceivable sin except that of murder. He was taken to the scaffold outside the barracks before a crowd of 4,000 onlookers. He was given 2 more opportunities to admit his guilt, but each time he said he was innocent and that he did not know who killed the Newey family. Markley was executed by hanging. He would be the first person in Frederick County, Maryland, to be tried, convicted, and sentenced to death based on circumstantial evidence. George Flot sold his Harbaugh Valley home, and he and his wife Margaret moved west to Somerset, Ohio, just southeast of Columbus, to be closer to some of his older children. George and many of his relatives changed their name to Floyd, perhaps to escape connection with the Newey family murders, since that was countrywide news at the time. However, in 1903, one of the ancestors of George Flot said that they changed their German name of Flot to that of the French name Floyd to reflect their actual French descent. Note that George Flot was Roman Catholic and from French descent. He most likely got the name Flot because he lived in a German community in Pennsylvania and Maryland. George died in Ohio on November the 28th, 1862, at the age of 82. His wife Margaret died in Ohio on August the 7th, 1867, at the age of 62. An article appeared in the Cincinnati Commercial Appeal in January of 1867, which is an Ohio newspaper. An inaccurate report of the Newey murders was published, followed by a statement by a physician who said that he treated a man on his deathbed who gave a very detailed description of the events of the Newey murders, including the murders, the fire, and the trial and execution of John Markley. The doctor was told that the murderer and Newey was good friends until the murderer lost a lawsuit in which Newey testified against the murderer's position. The dying man revealed that his anger led him to murder Newey and his family and to frame John Markley. The dying man said that he killed the Newey family, invited Markley to sleep in his barn, and the next morning slipped Newey's belongings into the unsuspected Markley's bag. The doctor never revealed his patient's name, but did mention that the dying man said that he lived closest to the Neweys at the time of the murders. Being that George Flot was the closest neighbor, a friend of Newey, a resident of Ohio, and a regular in court over legal suits, this points to the dying man admitting to killing the Neweys, being none other than George Flot. The Newey murders is a story of death. John, Lydia, Ann, and Ruth Newey, along with an unborn, Mr. Jacob Tressler, and John Coombs, all succumbed to blows and flames. John Markley died by the hangman's noose for the crime, and George Flot died of old age in Ohio. Though the horror of that night still haunts the memories of the people of this area today, life still goes on as the events become more and more vague as death claims the people who remember the most. As the knowledge is lost, the history and the story are lost as well. We may never know who truly killed the Newey family. Was it John Markley? Was it George Flot? Only the history lost in time truly knows. I would like to thank my cousin Ben here, Ben Berman, for joining me on this video and for allowing me to share a bit of his family history to you all. I'm sorry that we couldn't bring you to the foundation of the Newey home or the gravesite of the Newey family. We are unfortunately living in times where people, have to worry about liability issues, people being sued, so they were really hesitant to allow us to come in and show the world, what was there and where it was at. So hence the reason why I'm not disclosing a whole lot of the location, just putting you in a general vicinity. Again, who knows, you might be able to find that information, but, I don't want to put these guys in a situation where people are going to be running into property trying to, trespass or get themselves hurt and wind up suing people, and we don't want to do that. We want to try to preserve the history that is there and not have the people frolicking in there and enforcing them to completely close it off completely to everything and everyone. So again, that's the reason why we're not disclosing locations and also why we're not on the property itself. So anyway, with that being said, again, I want to thank my cousin here for joining me on this little adventure and telling the tale. And if you like this video, please give me a like. And if you want to see more, please subscribe to my channel for more. And I will see you later. And Ben will most likely see you later as well. So, thank you.